proudly present Assembly Bill 3089, the California Apology Act for the perpetration of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity, with special consideration for African slaves and their descendants. In 2020, California created the first in the nation state-level task force to study and develop reparations proposals with a special consideration for African Americans. Along with our Senate colleague from Gardena, I had the privilege of sitting on that task force and being part of the groundbreaking report that resulted. For more than 2 years, the 9-member task force heard countless hours of testimony and received thousands of pages of documents from state agencies, historians, archivists, economists, private businesses, legal experts, families of former slave owners, and the descendants of slaves and sharecroppers. Based on the testimony and documentation, the task force issued its report to the legislature, a painstaking recitation of the horrible treatment of African slaves and the ways in which this state and the nation benefited from forced human slave labor and how it continued to subjugate Black Californians well into recent times. As required by statute, the task force was required to include in its findings how the state of California will offer a formal apology on behalf of the people of California for the perpetration of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants. This body has already heard and passed a measure on this subject, ACR 135, Weber, a resolution that outlined and acknowledged the horrific acts against African slaves throughout our history within our state. Where the resolution states to set the stage and the acknowledgement of the harms, AB 3089 provides the formal apology on behalf of the state of California for its complicity in the human chattel slavery of our nation's past and the lasting badges and harms of slavery system. This bill offers the next step in the truth and reconciliation process by offering a formal apology for past wrongs. California will join 9 other states that have offered some form of apology for their role in slavery: Alabama, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Maryland, New Jersey, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia have all enacted some form of apology for their role in the slave trade. Even though our state entered the Union as a free state, every branch of government has had a hand in perpetrating the oppression of Black folks. This bill is an opportunity to confront those tough truths in a meaningful way. It is long past for the state to acknowledge its role and responsibility for the atrocities that promoted and facilitated the institution of slavery. The state of California is and should continue to affirm its role in protecting and uplifting the descendants of enslaved people who've been harmed by a legacy of state-sanctioned policies. I would like to thank the members of this body for acknowledging the fact that if we continue to ignore our past, we're doomed to repeat those failures. For those who would question why we need to move this measure, why we need to formally address acts of the distant past, I would simply say this: we cannot possibly move forward without acknowledging our role in an evil behavior. Every young child will tell you if you, in this case, the state, did something wrong, then you must apologize before making amends. Today starts that long overdue process. Thank you, Speaker and members, and I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Jones-Sawyer. Assemblymember McKinner, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of AB 3089. To the Assembly member from South Los Angeles, I want to thank you for authoring AB 3089 and for bringing this legislation forward as a part of the California Legislative Black Caucus Reparation Legislative Package. And as this is your last year in the California State Assembly, I want to personally thank you, Reggie, for your wisdom, courage, and fearlessness in tackling some of the most challenging issues facing Black Californians. Members, AB 3089 is part of a multi-year effort to address the negative legacy and impacts from slavery and to the harm that was caused not just to enslaved persons, but to the descendants of enslaved persons, harms that continue to this day. Following the end of apartheid in South Africa, that nation formed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a public effort to speak truth to the horrors of apartheid and to allow those in government to take responsibility for their actions and to allow for the public to heal. AB 3089 recognizes the harm that slavery had and continues to have on Black Californians and take the important step of acknowledging and formally apologizing for the state's role in harming the descendants of enslaved people. Members, as we begin this journey to repair the harm caused by slavery, we must start by accepting responsibility for those in powers that prompted discrimination and those that developed systemic structures of discriminations that still remain to this day. The journey ahead will not be easy, my friends, but I am proud to be working with members of the State Assembly, the State Senate, and our governor, shoulder to shoulder, crown to crown, to ensure that all descendants of slavery are granted the dignity and justice they deserve. I respectfully ask for your aye vote on AB 3089. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember McKinnon. Assemblymember Rendon, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The author asked me to speak on behalf of this bill. I think as a thank you for my appointing him to this committee, but I want to turn things around and thank him. In his own words, he spent countless hours on this effort. Also want to thank our public appointee who did an amazing job as well. I think this comes at an interesting time. Last week, the Shenandoah, Virginia School District, which 2 years ago decided to strip 2 Confederate titles from their schools, this past week decided to put those Confederate names back on those schools. It's hard in any one moment to think about the tide of history and the progress we are or are not making. In any given stolen moment, it's hard to isolate the tide of history. In Virginia, obviously, the tide of history, in my opinion, seems to be going in a very different way than it is in this body. This is a statement of our values. This is a statement of who we are and what we think at this moment. And that's why it's so important to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Assemblymember Rendon. Moving to Dr. Weber, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, members. I rise in support of my colleague and AB 3089, which will provide an apology for the perpetuation of gross human right violations related to human enslavement and the state's perpetuation in the lasting badges and incidents of slavery within our territories. As we all know, the California Reparations Task Force was created in this body through AB 3121 in 2020, authored by now Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber. And this very task force identified, compiled, synthesized the relevant copious of evidentiary documentation of these badges of slavery that existed within California. I have asked many times on this floor, and I hope that by now you have actually read the report, or at a minimum, read the executive summary, so that you understand what we are talking about and what we have been talking about. This apology is a part of repairing the moral, physical, and dignity harms that we as a state have caused. An apology is not a new thing, and it's not anything that really should be complicated nor controversial, because it's the right thing to do. When you have done a wrong, you first acknowledge it, and you apologize. The second is that you apologize, and then the third thing is that you do better. And we have done this as a state. In 2019, Governor Newsom rightfully issued an apology to California's Native people for the many instances of violent mistreatment and neglect inflicted upon them throughout California's history. In 2020, this legislative body unanimously, let me say that again. In 2020, this legislative body unanimously voted to apologize for its role in the incarceration of persons of Japanese descent into the internment camps. AB 3089 apologizes for California's role in perpetuating the badges of slavery. To quote a social and civil activist, Angela Davis, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. Let's change the wrongs by first apologizing for them. And for that, I respectfully ask for your vote on AB 3089. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Assemblymember Wilson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, as chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus, I rise today with the support of our Affinity Caucus to express our unwavering support for AB 3089, the Apology Act for gross human right violations with a special consideration for slavery descendants. For centuries, the stain of slavery has marred the fabric of our nation's history, inflicting immeasurable suffering and enduring consequences on generations of African Americans. The legacy of slavery continues to reverberate throughout our society, manifesting in systemic injustices and disparities that persist to this day. AB 3089 represents a significant step towards acknowledging the profound injustices inflicted upon enslaved individuals and their descendants. By issuing a formal apology, California reaffirms its commitment to truth, reconciliation, and healing. Moreover, by providing special consideration for slavery descendants, this legislation acknowledges the unique hardships faced by those whose ancestors endured the horrors of bondage. As representatives of the people, it is our moral imperative to confront the injustices of the past with honesty and humility. AB 3089 embodies our collective responsibility to reckon with the sins of history and pave the way for a more just and equitable future. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this vital piece of legislation. Let us stand on the right side of history and send a powerful message of solidarity and redemption to all those whose lives have been touched by the legacy of slavery. And I'll note, as my seatmate and my colleague from Contra Costa regularly whispers in my ear when the Black Caucus or other affinity caucuses bring up these types of issues, he says, we are in the right place, and this is the right time to do the right thing. With that, colleagues, I urge and I vote on AB 3089.
Thank you, Assemblymember Wilson. Assemblymember Bonta, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. As a joint author, I rise in strong support of AB 3089 and very thankful to my colleague from South LA for doing so. California's history is marred by grave injustices inflicted on Black Californians. Despite the abolition of slavery upon our state's inception into the Union in 1850, systemic oppression persisted due to the failure to enforce this provision in this state. From denying fundamental liberties to establishing insurmountable racial barriers, our state's history bears the scars of discriminatory practices that have deeply wounded descendants of slaves in California. We must acknowledge how these past injustices continue to reverberate through our lived experiences today. Discriminatory housing policies, segregation laws, unjust zoning ordinances have entrenched housing segregation and economic disparities among Black Americans. These structural inequities have perpetuated persistent inequalities in education, economic opportunity, and wealth generation for our communities. The legacy of slavery requires Black Californians to continue to endure discrimination in healthcare, facing inaccurate diagnoses and a lack of culturally concordant care. It is incumbent upon us as representatives of the people to recognize and accept responsibility for the harms and atrocities committed against our communities. The 1,000-plus page report released by the Reparation Task Force lays out a myriad of policy recommendations to remedy these wrongs. At the most basic level is a formal acknowledgment, a formal apology request for California's role in enslavement. An apology will not erase the history. It will not automatically correct the harms Black Californians are suffering through today. But an apology does this. It acknowledges the painful truth that California was wrong, creates a path towards healing, holds all of us everyone with the power to influence policies accountable. Today, this body can take a significant step towards injustice or towards justice and reconciliation. And I respectfully ask for your aye vote on AB 3089.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bonta. Dr. Jackson, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to understand why an apology. And as we are debating this, we're not debating this as individuals. We're debating this as the state. The state is us. And so we are not talking about what any particular person may have done or not done. We're talking about what the people that was in this chamber voted on and authorized to be done to descendants of slaves. So as the state, what is in an apology? An apology is meant to help a people to heal, a people to overcome trauma, an opportunity for people to be able to move on, to begin their journey to thrive. So just like any healing process, first you acknowledge a wrong has been done. And once you have acknowledged a wrong has been done, you apologize to help that person or that community or that people to heal from the harm that has been done. And once we move from acknowledgement to apology, then on this floor we will move to atonement, to rectify those harms. So what is an apology? An apology is to recognize that you, as a human being, has been hurt by a state. And your harm is important to acknowledge and to apologize for that harm. There is no greater thing that we can do as a people on this floor than to ensure that we as a state has declared our wrongdoings and our commitment to rectify those. I want to thank one of our elders in our caucus, the member from South Los Angeles, in supporting AB 3089.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Assemblymember Barrett-Cahan, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I also rise on behalf of AB 3089. One of the most powerful experiences I had in my first year as a legislator was on public safety. Our colleague from Los Angeles, the one near Dodger Stadium, I don't know the parts of Los Angeles, I apologize, brought before us a bill to help rectify the forced sterilization of women in our prison system. And it was the first time in my legislative career that I had someone sitting before me who'd been harmed, not by me directly, but by this state. And she told her story. And I felt compelled to apologize to her. I was one of the only women sitting there. I'm a mother. We had taken that away from her. And it felt like I was sitting in this seat, and as like most of the women and people of color, we'd been excluded from these seats for so long, and here we were. And I could express to her how sorry I was that we did this to her. And we, as a body, are being given another opportunity to do that today. And I wanted to rise because, as a Jewish woman, one of the most important things that I'm taught is the power of apologizing. Once a year, none of us show up. We all go home, and we spend 10 days apologizing to the people we've wronged. On Yom Kippur, when the gates close, we know it's our obligation to have looked the people in the eyes who we've wronged in that year, to make amends with them, to say, I'm sorry, to ask forgiveness. We know that they may not give it to us. That's their choice. But it's on us to apologize, to say we're sorry for what we did. And the power of an apology is so strong. And that's what our faith teaches us. And so to be given this opportunity today feels like a privilege. And so I want to thank you, because this state has wronged Black people for longer than it ever should have. And as was mentioned by our colleague from San Diego, so many of the other ethnic caucuses have benefited from apologies like this. And so it is important for each and every one of us to stand up and say, we're here to support an apology for your community as well. And as our colleague from Oakland said, I live in the midst of the ongoing ramifications of these policies. I live in a community that is not as diverse as this great state because it had housing policies that excluded Black people for a very, very long time. And so my community still reflects those policies. Even though they're not legal anymore, we haven't fixed the problems because that will take far longer than any of us will be here. But we can start with this apology. We can follow it up with the work to try to make right these wrongs. And we can never wholly make it right. I know I recently got an apology from the Austrian government for what happened to my family. I cried when I got it. And yet, they can never make it wholly right, but they can apologize and they can do their best. And that is what is incumbent upon us today, is to understand the power of an apology, to look people in the eyes, to say, I am so sorry that we did this, that we continue to do this, and to also say that we will work for a better and more just California for every Black Californian. And with that, I respectfully ask for your aye vote on AB 3089.
Thank you, Ms. Bauer-Cahan. Mr. Speaker, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I, too, want to thank our colleague from Los Angeles for bringing forward this important legislation. In 1966, it was Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who wrote a letter to Cesar Chavez, who had recently marched from Delano to Sacramento. It was nearly a 300-mile walk. And he had marched to bring attention to the mistreatment of farm workers. In his letter, Dr. King stated, as brothers in the fight for equality, I extend the hand of fellowship and of goodwill, and wish continuing success to you and your members. Our separate struggles are really one: a struggle for freedom, for dignity, and for humanity. And history matters. And it's because of our history and the courageous leaders like Dr. King, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, so many others, because of the values instilled in me by my Mexican immigrant farm-working family, and because of their experiences, their struggles, their sacrifices, that I stand before all of you, not only in recognition, but in complete understanding that our separate struggles are really one. And as we know, it is undeniable that our systems of government have been complicit in the oppression of African Americans. Our courts, our schools, even this legislature, California's history is tarnished by the subjugation of Black people. Nearly 200 years ago, as has been stated a few times this morning, California prided itself on being a free state. Yet this very legislative body enacted the California Fugitive Slave Act of 1852. Enslaved Black men and women right here in California were stripped from their families, forced to work in mines, and do so at the disposal of their white owners. And today, slavery and oppression are often described as a scar on our history, a difficult yet undeniable history. It is a wound that still needs to heal. And this legislation, this formal apology from the state of California, recognizing and accepting responsibility, is a very crucial step. I applaud our California Legislative Black Caucus, the Reparations Task Force, for their work. And as Speaker, I urge all Californians to recognize, to accept, and to memorialize our formal apology for these harms and atrocities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seeing and hearing no further debate, Mr. Jones-Sawyer, would you like to close?
And I would like to thank the members of the Black Caucus who all got up to speak and who are standing now, who's standing behind me to make sure that this apology gets done. For the members who stood up, who may not be part of the Black Caucus but understand. But most important, the unity of both speakers getting up and speaking on behalf. The one that appointed me to this commission, to the task force, because it was a life-changing thing for me. Something that I can tell my ancestors long after that I was part of something that was transformational. And I want to thank the present speaker for continuing that obligation that we do what we need to do to make sure we fulfill the dream of reversing racism. I just want you to know that the governors of this state, the courts, and even this legislature have been complicit in a lot of the atrocities here in California. Peter Burnett, whose portrait is somewhere in this building, believed in the exclusion law. The exclusion law said, let's make sure that no African Americans, no black people lived in your state, and he pushed us out. But most important, you need to know, he advocated the LASH law, L-A-S-H, where black people were lashed and beaten every 6 months until they left the state that they were in. It was that kind of mentality early on that was difficult. We had legislatures that outlawed African Americans testifying or being involved in testifying against white people. Interracial marriage between black and white was illegal in this state until recent. They excluded us from homesteading and moving here to California. Refused state funding for African American children to attend white public schools. The California State Supreme Court said segregation in schools did not violate the 14th Amendment, which gave us the right to be full citizens. In the town square of San Jose, an African American was beaten. And when they brought it to court, the court said that that person could not be prosecuted because that person was an enslaved person, which means that was his property. We were people's properties in this state. And it was defended by the state Supreme Court and other courts. California Dems, unfortunately, back then in 1867, promised white voters that they would fight against Reconstruction and giving African Americans, Native Americans, Chinese Americans the right to vote. We've been dealing with gerrymandering and other things preventing us to vote. And then lastly, racial terror, which is probably something that a lot of us don't believe happened, but the KKK was firmly implanted in this state and was firmly doing their bidding all across this state. They were part of the judicial system, they were part of this legislature, and they were part of other places that made sure that they kept us down. In 1920, the Los Angeles Police Department actively recruited KKK members to be police officers. And you can imagine what impact that had on the black community. And so, as we look at the political disenfranchisement, housing segregation, not being able to live where you want to live, redlining, and ultimately places like where I live, which is Sugar Hill, where actresses like the first woman to receive an Oscar lived. They split us with freeways as they did up in Northern California, making sure that when an African American community started to thrive, they used whatever measures to disenfranchise them to make sure they didn't have the political power that could grow and benefit. This is why we're doing this. this is why an apology is so important. It's like someone who does something, and then it's okay that you apologize, and it's okay that you put it in writing, it's go as you say it, but most important, not only is the apology letter important, it's what we do after, is whether or not we go ahead and fulfill the dream of what my ancestors wanted, which is to fully making us part of the American dream. But most important, get rid of the river of racism that has been running through our communities for so many decades and centuries. And so with that, I ask for your aye vote on AB 3089. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones Sawyer. The clerk will open the roll. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. All those vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll and tally the votes. Ayes 62, no 0. Measure passes.